Hello and welcome, Law Curious. Today we try to break down the Texas border battle between Texas and the federal government. We want to give you the basic legal facts, so you can decide who you think is right and who you think is wrong. There's no spin, there's no partisanship, no politics, just the straight legal facts. And then we'll give you our best prediction as to what we think will happen as a result of the outcome. So let's frame the issue for you. Here's what happened. Texas passes a law that's known as SB 4. SB 4 makes it a misdemeanor to illegally cross the border into Texas, and it allows the Texas State Police then to arrest people for those misdemeanors, to take them before a judge, and if they're guilty, the judge can fine them, send them to jail, and also order them deported and send them and deliver them to the border to be removed from Texas and from the country. That's the Texas law in a nutshell. So what happened is the federal government filed a lawsuit saying that this Texas state law is unconstitutional, a big word for illegal. Basically what it said is it interferes with the federal government's exclusive authority to manage immigration, to manage border issues, and that is something that only the federal government can do and that the states don't have the right to get involved in that area. So what does that mean? Let's unpackage this for you. First of all, under our Constitution, some issues are exclusively for the federal government, and some issues are exclusively for the state government. And what that means is, in those areas, no one else is allowed to interfere. So certain things states have the right to do, and the federal government doesn't have the right to get involved. And the reciprocal is true too. Certain things the federal government exclusively has the right to do, and the states don't have the right to get involved. Now, there are some legal issues upon which each of them can get involved and each can pass laws, and so you can have concurrent jurisdiction overlapping. The question here then is, where does immigration fit? Well, under longstanding law, generally it's been understood that immigration law is exclusively the business of the federal government. And that's in part because immigration touches on foreign policy issues related to how our government interacts with other countries, working with foreign governments and foreign leaders to figure out immigration between countries, who we're going to accept, who we're not going to accept, why we won't, how we send them back, and the like. And so what that generally means is that it belongs to the federal government and is exclusively for the federal government. Now, what has happened here is the state of Texas has obviously passed a law allowing it to decide who gets to stay in America and who gets to be removed. And so what the federal government is saying here is that that question is something you don't have the right to be involved in. That's exclusively for the federal government to figure out who is deportable, who's removable, who's not. Now, where does this power come from that says this belongs to the federal government? Well, the argument is that it comes, as you can see, from the Constitution. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 4 of our Constitution says that the federal government has the power to establish a uniform rule of naturalization. And from that language, it's come to be understood from the Supreme Court that the federal government, therefore, has the exclusive right to pass laws and rules that relate to the naturalization process, the immigration process. The Supreme Court has also long held that this power exclusively belongs to the federal government because the federal government is the one involved in conducting foreign relations with other countries, and immigration policy falls into that. So that's one side of the argument. Now let me give you the other side of the argument. The state law mirrors federal law in essence and says that if you're here in America without permission, you can be removed. So that's the first point. There is no inconsistency between the laws. We're simply mirroring the law. And number two, and this is critical, what Texas has said is that there is a crisis that's atypical, a genuinely atypical crisis that requires Texas to step in because Texas is at the epicenter of this crisis. And so specifically the argument is that under the Constitution, there's another provision, generally known as the State War Clause. And the State War Clause basically says this: states may sometimes act on their own without Congress on foreign power, foreign policy type issues where they have been, quote, actually invaded or in such imminent danger as will not admit of delay. And so basically the proponents of SB 4 say that this language, the nature and texture of this language is such that they're in a situation of such extreme importance that Texas has been invaded and that it doesn't have to rely at this moment in time on Congress, even if it does in other times. But at this specific moment, given the circumstances, it can act on its own. And so the point here is that the core argument is we're in a particular crisis located to this time and place, and so that's why we have the right to act. Now, by way of background, here is some historical law on this. There are basically no cases where states have actually done this with respect to immigration policy, such that they have usurped the role of the federal government because of this type of an emergency. And so, in this sense, the case is a first. Now, there are cases dealing with states passing laws to try to touch on immigration issues, and those laws have been addressed, and this is what will count as precedent as we try to figure out if Texas SB4 stands or if it falls. And so one case that everyone will look at is a Supreme Court decision from the early 2000s called Arizona versus the United States of America. And here, Arizona passed a state law that addressed illegal immigration. It was an Arizona law that said those who come here illegally are violating state law, and so it's a crime. Police, therefore, are allowed to inquire about one's immigration status to then figure out if people are committing crimes or not, arrest them, detain them, based on the suspicion of them being here illegally. And the Supreme Court eventually got this case and said that this Arizona law was invalid because it interfered with the federal government's right to control immigration. Now, that case, of course, in all fairness to the current situation, it didn't rely on this act of emergency type doctrine that Texas is relying on. And so in that sense, it's a little bit different. So that's both sides of the arguments. You've heard the proponents and you've heard the people against it. Let's give you our prediction. What do we think best odds are will happen? We think that the law that has long treated immigration as a national security related issue, as something belonging exclusively to the federal government, as immigration policy as to who can be deported or not deported is exclusively for the federal government. There are many laws passed by Congress on this. The states have never been historically passing laws on this. We think all of that will ultimately lead the federal courts and ultimately the Supreme Court, if it gets it, to decide that SB4 is unconstitutional. And they will find it too similar to that Arizona case, for example, and they won't justify this act of emergency invasion theory that Texas has adopted. And so basically what we predict is the Supreme Court will basically say that we understand that many states at the border are very frustrated. We understand people are frustrated. And the remedy is to vote different elected officials in the House of Representatives, the Senate, and the presidency, of course, to change national policy. And that's the remedy. But what we don't think the Supreme Court ultimately will do is allow states to start passing these laws in the name of emergencies that create different regimes for certain people to then be deported who may not be deportable under federal law. And if you just stop and think big picture about what this could mean, is we have, many states that actually border foreign countries, and they could all have different laws that they pass. Some could be saying there's an emergency, we need to do this. Some could be saying there's an emergency, we need to do that. And we could create a whole patchwork of inconsistent laws that relate to deporting people instead of having one uniform set that decides who gets to be here and who doesn't. And so that's our best sense for those of you who are law curious of how we think this battle over Texas SB4 will come down. Thank you very much. And as always, we hope you enjoyed this program and stay tuned to watch more of our law curious programs.